This week's lesson is going to be on female anatomy. And we're going to give a bit of an introduction, and we're going to look at the larger structures and just sort of get the lay of the land here. So there are a lot of similarities between the female and male reproductive systems, and that in the female system, we're also making gametes or sex cells. Those are going to be referred to as the ova or egg. And we'll also talk about the female hormones that are produced, number of estrogens and progesterone. Now, the female system is a little bit more complex in male in that the female also has the job of receiving the male gametes. We'll talk about that in the fertilization lesson. And it also has the role of protecting and supporting the developing embryo and fetus. That will be covered in the pregnancy and gestation lectures. So let's just get used to looking at this view here. We have another sagittal section here. So you can imagine this plane is cut through this female model here. And now we're able to see the internal structures. So we will spend some time talking about the ovary. Okay? And then the network of ducts and glands that are associated with the ovary. The ovary is going to be really similar to the male system's testicle, right? It's the female gonad. And this network of ducts, right? We've got the uterine tube, we've got the uterus, right? The outlet here, the cervix, and we leave through the vagina here. So we have this network of ducts as well. Just want to call your attention to some of those structures. There are some external structures we'll talk about at the end of this lecture, and also some glands that we need to be aware of. Let's get a slightly different view here. So this is a posterior view of the uterus. So again, at this point now we're imagining that we're looking at someone standing facing away from us. So if we had X-ray vision and we were looking through their back and through their buttocks, and we could see in there, we can see now the uterus centrally located, and we can see now that the ovaries are two paired organs, just like the testes. Again, these are the female gonads. They're going to produce the female gametes. Those are the ova or the eggs, and it's those structures inside the ovary that are going to be taxed with producing the female hormones. And again, we just get a slightly different view of our secondary structures, our ducts, right? So we can see our uterine tubes, they're paired. You can see our uterus, our cervix, and then the vagina is really cut off in this particular view. So we can only see the top third of it. Let's talk more about the ovaries. So they're actually lumpy almond-shaped organs, so they're pretty small structures, but they have great importance. And if we cut an ovary open, just like we had cut a testicle open last week, we can see what's inside here, and the structure internally is markedly different. Okay, so the inside of an ovary is completely solid. And within that completely solid mass, we can divide the structure up into two main parts. Okay, this is common of just about any solid organ in the body. Okay, so the outer part is called the cortex, right? So all of this is referred to as the cortex of the ovary. This is where all of the interesting stuff happens. This is the site of oogenesis, or egg production. And the inside of the ovary, we're going to call that the medulla. Think medulla starts with an M, the word middle starts with an M. So that's the center there. What goes on in the medulla is really just supporting those tissues. Okay, so we can see, if I erase everything on the slide there, we can see that we have an artery and a vein coming into the medulla. You can imagine there's nervous tissue, connective tissue, anything that really needs to support the ovary. But all of the action, all of the really exciting stuff is happening within the cortex, that outer layer. So let's take a closer look here. Let's zoom in and see what's going on in here. So again, this is much less organized than the male system. And we know that all the action has happened in the cortex, but there's a lot going on here. So each oocyte, each egg, is actually contained within something called a follicle. Something else that's very different about the female system is a female is born with all of the eggs she's ever going to have. So as that female child is born, she's got all of her eggs and they're already contained within follicles. So we have a very different setup here. We're not creating sperm daily. We're just taking those already existing eggs within their follicles and we're maturing them in small batches. What do I mean by that? So most of the follicles that you're going to see are going to be called primordial follicles. They are the least mature. So these little things, they look very simple. And you can see that there is a dark dot in the middle. That's where the oocyte is. And there's a little bit of supporting cells. The names of those cells that support and help the egg grow are going to be called theca cells and granulosa cells. Okay, so that follicle, the primordial follicle, every month a few primordial follicles will start to mature and become primary follicles. This figure is very simplified. Okay, so it's not just one primary follicle, there's going to be a whole batch of them, like 40. Okay, and those primary follicles will start to grow. We can see this is larger in size. You can see that there's other cells here now. Those would be the theca and the granulosa getting together. And then after a couple months of growth there, the primary follicle will then become a secondary follicle. The only thing that's really different here is the size is larger, and then we can start to see these little fluid-filled patches in here. And then finally, some of the secondary follicles will grow and become tertiary follicles. So I said we probably started with 40 primordial follicles. You're not going to end up with 40 tertiary follicles. All along the way, we're selecting the best ones. So there should only be 2 or 3 really big tertiary follicles at any given time that might actually be worthy of the next process, which is going to be ovulation. Okay, the tertiary follicle, the big difference between that and secondary is we can see this large fluid-filled structure. Everything's kind of gotten together, gotten a lot more organized, okay? And it is the biggest and the best tertiary follicle that will get selected for ovulation. This is a very slow process. Again, if you cut open an ovary, you would be able to see all 4 different follicular stages. Okay, but there would be a lot more going on in there. One other name I want to call your attention to is this term Graphian. Graphian is an older term to refer to the biggest and best tertiary follicle. Okay, so you might see that in older books, or maybe you've learned that before in another class. So Graphian is that term that's given to the biggest and best tertiary follicles. Again, this process to go from each stage is going to take several months. So it's a lot slower than sperm production, which we already knew that took 2 or 3 months. So it's going to take a long time to get an egg produced from start to finish. All right, so the Graphian follicles will then undergo the process of ovulation. This is a little bit messier of a process versus the male system. Mature sperm just flowed into the next part of the duct system. This does not happen in the female system. We actually have to break a hole in the wall of the ovary and force the egg out. So it's a bit more of a violent process. So we have this 4-panel diagram that we can take a look at here. So what happens, we're going to take a look at one of our tertiary or Graafian follicles here. It's very big, it's very mature, it's pumping out lots of estrogen and other hormones from those granulosa cells that we're producing. And it's going to, whenever it's ready, line up right against the ovarian wall there. That place in the ovarian wall is called a stigma. Okay? This is a weak point in the ovarian wall. So this is the most likely place that the follicle is going to be able to force the egg out. Moving into the next panel, we'll see what happens here. The egg, okay, is then forced out of its follicle. A few of the granulosa cells will come with it as it leaves. So we'll move on to this next panel. Okay, we can see our egg there, that's in pink, and then these other little orange cells that are around it are just a couple extra granulosa cells that are coming along for the ride. And then we can see the bulk of the follicle is actually left behind. Okay, and they're really going to part ways here at this point. So our ovulated egg is going to head now into the network of ducts and tubes and secondary structures in the female reproductive system, and the follicle gets left behind and becomes what is now known as the corpus luteum. I just want to make a comment on atresia. So remember I said about 40 primordial follicles will become primary follicles. And the selection process is going to go on every month. And the entire process takes multiple months to get us to ovulate one egg. What happens to all of those other eggs, right? I said that only one is going to get chosen each month out of the group of 40, and then we kind of keep moving on and on through the cycle here. So most of the eggs are going to undergo atresia. Okay? A female baby is born with 2 million follicles, those primordial follicles, at birth per ovary. Now, before she even reaches puberty and starts ovulating, a bunch of these cells are going to die. So most of the weak ones are screened out right away. Okay, so we are down by a factor of 10. Right, 200,000 are left at puberty. Now, at puberty, you enter your reproductive years, ovulation starts to happen. And then at 35, we've only been about halfway through our fertile years, and yet half of our follicles again are now gone, so we're down to 10,000. By the time we reach 50, which is the time of menopause, we're really running out of follicles. And this is why we will undergo menopause. We've ran out of eggs. That's the simple end of the story. So when you think about how many are actually going to ovulate, let's say you undergo puberty at age 10 and you undergo menopause at age 50, that is 40 years of reproductive fertility, and you're only going to use 400 to 500 of those good follicles that you're going to ovulate. So the vast majority of them don't do anything. They become atretic. They just die. So that puts a little bit of perspective on it. And we are born with all of the eggs that we're ever going to need. We're probably only going to use 400 or 500 of them, and the rest are really just coming along for the ride. So it's all about a screening process and really picking the best ones and getting rid of the ones we don't need. Okay, let's move back into our image of the ovary here. So we've already gotten to this stage where we have ovulated, right? Our egg and a couple of cells are parting ways, but the bulk of the follicle is still here. So let's talk a little bit about the corpus luteum. Okay, it's called the corpus luteum because the cells are going to start to luteinize. Okay, they'll fill in any of that cavity, any empty space, and they're going to pump out more hormones. But instead of estrogens, they're really switching over to more of progesterone. Okay, and that corpus luteum, that thing will stick around for about 2 weeks, and then it's got a decision to make. Okay, normally after 2 weeks, it's going to degrade into something called the corpus albicans and disappear, or the corpus luteum can stick around during pregnancy. Just to help you out with these terms a little bit, corpus just means body. Okay? Luteum actually means yellow. And albicans, think albino, albicans means white. I don't particularly like this figure because I think the corpus albicans should be painted a little bit more white. It actually looks more yellow than the corpus luteum in this figure. Okay, so again, if pregnancy is to occur, we'll keep the corpus luteum around because we'll need to produce more progesterone to maintain pregnancy. Or if we don't get pregnant, then after 2 weeks, corpus luteum becomes corpus albicans and should really just get smaller and smaller until it disappears into a tiny little scar mark. Now, what happens if the corpus luteum doesn't degrade properly into the corpus albicans, or if you do have too many follicles around and they're not properly undergoing atresia? Well, then you are probably one of the 5 to 10% of women that has polycystic ovary disease, also known as PCOS. This is the most common endocrine disorder. Okay, the polycystic ovary disease refers to these cysts that form, and they really are just unovulated follicles, things that should have undergone atresia and didn't. Perhaps old corpus luteum that are sticking around and not degrading. And instead of, having this normal ovary here where you could expect to see, one large follicle at a time, and we end up with a cystic ovary, which has all of these leftover cysts that just simply aren't going away. The cysts, because they're filled with granulosa and theca cells, they're going to keep pumping out estrogens and progesterones, and that's really going to affect fertility. There has to be a very specific pattern of estrogen release when we're growing a nice big tertiary follicle and a pattern of progesterone release when we are prepping our corpus luteum. If we have all of these cysts, all of those hormones are going to get dysregulated. We're going to get missed messages, and that's really going to negatively impact fertility. You can get hirsutism, which is unwanted hair growth. There is a greater risk for obesity and diabetes among this population. And really the best thing that is on the market today for treatment is taking a hormonal birth control. This will override what the ovary is sending to the brain in terms of signals and in estrogens and progesterones. And what's going to happen is the brain will kind of take over and start regulating and getting back into a normal cycle as you take your oral contraceptive every day. That should help prevent cyst formation and restore fertility. Although obviously in order to actually be fertile, you got to stop taking your birth control pills at some point. So this is just kind of a temporary fix to get everything back in sync again. Okay, and the last thing I want to say before I pause the lecture is I'll just make a note about ovarian cancer. Okay, this, just like testicular cancer, is a particularly common and deadly cancer. Okay, if we think about what needs to happen in the ovary, because we don't have this nice ductwork like we do in the male system inside the ovary, what happens is every time a follicle is ovulated, there's a little scar, there's a little bit of damage in that ovarian wall. So that ovary has to be repaired. Again, anytime we're repairing tissues and we're doing cell division, we could potentially make a mistake. If we make a mistake, then cell division might not be regulated and we start making tumors. Okay, the way to reduce risk is one, ovulate less. So if you get pregnant, you're not ovulating for 9 months. If you're nursing, you're obviously, you're also not ovulating during the beginning part of that nursing. Or you could take oral contraceptives, these hormonal birth control pills, which will prevent you from ovulating. There is no current test right now other than screening for the BRCA gene. I mentioned this before with prostate cancer, so that's a clue that you might be at risk. If you're a male, you might get prostate cancer. If you're a female and you have the BRCA gene, you might be at higher risk for ovarian cancer. And also the name gives a nod back to the fact that you're also likely at risk for breast cancer. Okay. Because you can't palpate ovaries in the way that you can palpate testes, this is very poorly detected, which is why this is a much more concerning cancer. You typically don't know you have it until it's too late. So the prognosis for survival is very poor for ovarian cancer.